Hello and welcome to this next PowerPoint in the series on literary theory. This one goes over one of my favorite theories to use to analyze literature, which is mythological criticism. And it works on different facets, but basically it's the use of universal symbols and stories to help understand what we're reading in a way that goes back centuries. Mythological criticism is basically that the author's work is a new version of the same story that's been told since human storytelling began. We tend to follow similar patterns, similar plot lines, and develop similar types of characters that we've been doing for centuries and in fact millennia. And a lot of this is based on the work of Carl Jung. He was one of the disciples, one of the followers of Sigmund Freud. So it has some basis on psychology. But in this case, instead of it being a personal view into why someone acts the way they do, it's a universal. Why does humanity tell each other these kind of stories? And also, very importantly, Joseph Campbell, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Joseph Campbell wrote this very influential book after studying the ancient texts from all sorts of cultural traditions. And he found that there were a lot of recurrent patterns, that we tend to see the same kind of journey over and over again in tales that you would think would be disparately different because of the cultural background. So for his example, he looked at Christian stories of Jesus. He looked at the Indian epic Gilgamesh. He even looked at stories of the Buddha, and he found the same kind of patterns, sometimes plot points, sometimes characteristics of the hero, but oftentimes this recurrent trend in the journey that the heroes followed. So it looks at these universal patterns, and one of the things I like about it is that it looks at many different disciplines of study. So I already mentioned psychology, but it also looks at anthropology, the study of human culture. It looks at history, obviously, and even religion. There's not a lot of key terms for this, just really two, and the first one's archetype. If you think of the root of that word, arc means rule. So an archetype is a type of character that tends to follow the same kind of rule. And a lot of this has to do with the collective unconscious. If we think back to our primordial ancestors, when they first gathered around the fire to tell each other stories, some of those stuck to a human consciousness that all of us have like coded into our DNA that we then turn to time and time again as we tell our own stories. So think of a fear of the dark, for example, the woods being this mysterious, potentially scary place that a lot of fairy tales dwell on. Well, think what the dark woods would have been to our primordial ancestors who had real predators there lurking without the eyesight advantage that their predators had. That must have been terrifying for our ancestors. So it makes sense that even now, when we think of the woods, there's this underlying sense of unease. Or when we think of the dark is never associated with light at the end of the tunnel or getting through a hardship. It's always about being at your lowest point. So we're going to look at three different facets with this, because you can take this in a very simplistic way or you can get very, very complex with it. The very first facet is very basic. It's just being able to identify when an author uses allusions, especially religious allusions and literary allusions. So stories and characters from the Bible, and then stories and characters from mythology, especially Greek and Roman mythology. So we've already seen in Small Island how that can be important. Facet 2 is when we start talking about symbols, and that too we've already done, and you should have done quite a bit of that, last year for English Lang. The third facet is the one that kind of combines everything, and we connect this text to older stories that we may see in the Bible or in ancient epic or the Odyssey or things of that nature. So for example, if we look just at facet 1, which is just being able to identify allusions when an author uses it, let's look at this Small Island sample that we've looked at before, but we're going to focus on a different part. So this is Hortense describing that first class in her teacher training program that she thought was just horrible. Remember, 60 pupils, and she described them in terrific ways. But interestingly, she uses some biblical allusions. She She mentions Job when she says Job himself would have wept genuine tears trying to get this rabble to face the board at once. And Solomon would have scratched his head trying to understand what that wretched boy Percival Brown did with all the pencils. Percival Brown was the kid that she gave the pencils to pass them out, and then all of a sudden he ran out because obviously he stole them. Now, we already looked at how this has post-colonial issues. But what about the allusions? Okay, Job. Job is a character from the Bible who went through all these horrific ordeals. Half of his livestock died, and that really hurt him economically. Even worse, half of his children died. And then to make matters worse, he got leprosy, this horrible skin disease that makes people avoid him at all costs. But he never lost his faith in God. So the fact that Hortense is saying even Job would have lost his patience is really exaggerating just how horrible she thinks these children are. And then you have Solomon, also from the Bible. He was the second king of Israel, the son of David, and he was world-renowned for his wisdom. People came from far and wide to hear his advice. One of the classic tales about Solomon is that two women came arguing that this one child was both theirs. And then they were arguing back and forth, and Solomon finally said, okay, you know what, just split the baby in half, and each of you can have a half. And then one woman said, no, I'd rather she have the baby than he come to harm. And that's when Solomon said, then you're the mother, because a mother would not ever want to harm her child. So he's known for his wisdom. But just like in the Job allusion, Hortense is saying even Solomon wouldn't have been able to figure out what Percival Brown did to these pencils. So that's just one way that you can use mythological criticism to better understand what the author's trying to get across about the characters and the stories. And sometimes, in this case, there's some humor in it too, because it's so over the top, the way she's describing these children. So let's move on to facet 2, symbols. Like I said, you might have used some of this before. And it's really crucial because oftentimes authors, and especially poets, really rely on this to communicate much more than they just say on the page. And one of the archetypical symbols are colors. We think of red. Obviously, red is passion, but it also can be something dangerous or daring. Black is synonymous with death. White is the opposite, innocence, purity. Green, it's associated with nature, but sometimes it can also be associated with greed because money, for instance. Yellow is caution, blue is peace, pink femininity, so on and so forth. Then you have natural elements, like spring is always about rebirth, right? Because things come back that had lain dormant or gone leafless, for example. During the winter, they come back to life. Summer is about maturity. Autumn is about decline, because now we're getting closer to death, winter, but we're not quite there yet, so it's about aging, and then winter is obviously death. Light, similarly to spring, is about truth, warmth, safety, knowledge. Something dark like the woods is usually evil or danger. Apple, that goes back to the Bible, and it's about loss of innocence, temptation, but also knowledge. Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's not like the apple itself is evil, it's just knowledge of everything. So the apple, which is why teachers are often associated with it, is also representative of knowledge. Weeds are evil, outcasts. Flowers are youth and beauty, but also something ephemeral, doesn't last long. And water is so crucial. Water is about rebirth. And artists throughout history have really relied on that. Even Beyonce, for example, in her music videos, has water as something rejuvenating. So now let's look at another small island sample, looking at symbols. So this is when Hortense helps to deliver Queenie's baby. And she delivers the child, and she's so happy that her dress didn't get any blood on it. Because remember, she's wearing her wedding dress because she went to apply for the teaching position, and she didn't get it. But she wanted to look good, so she wore her wedding dress. But then her dress does get ruined when the afterbirth, the placenta, comes out of Queenie. So she says, soaking pink with the bloody splattered tissue, my poor dress wept. I picked up this slippery excretion and dumped it in the boiled water. With no doubt in my mind that this English woman would probably wash her vegetables in the same bowl tomorrow. Mrs. Blythe tutted at the sight of my spoiled dress and said, come and look at him, Hortense. She was crying again. He's a lovely little boy. And I said to myself, Hortense, come. This is a gift from the Lord. life. What price is a little disgust on your best dress? I decided to pay no mind. So notice that twice she says something about her dress getting spoiled. First, it's bloody splattered tissue, my poor dress wept. So she's focusing more on her dress in the beginning than the birth of the child, which is kind of typical or tense. And notice she says pink. Pink represents femininity, and there's nothing more feminine and powerful than a woman giving birth. But for Hortense, she can't think of that right now. She can only think of what she's had to sacrifice, which is her dress, which is why she uses the personification that her dress cries. And then later on, she also says spoiled. But then a big shift happens, and this moment is symbolically important because all of a sudden Hortense forgets about the dress and instead focuses on the child, even though it's obviously not Bernard's child, and that should be scandalous, and she should be thinking about that. No, what's important is this new life, this miracle. And notice the hyphen used to emphasize this. This is a gift from the Lord. Pause. Life. And why this is important is because here we have a literal birth, but it's also Hortense's rebirth, where she starts to redeem herself from some of her worst qualities and starts to see life anew. After this, she's able to appreciate Gilbert more, especially the new house he's able to get for them both. So this moment is a birth for Michael, but it's also a birth for Hortense. And it's so symbolically important that she helps to deliver the child of the man he once loved, the child of the man who they used to see the chickens lay their eggs. So there were hints of fertility all along, and we see them come full circle. And even though it's not Hortense who's given birth, she becomes a mother in this scene too, because she will be adopting Michael. She doesn't know it yet, but within a few pages of the novel she does. So this scene really builds on those symbols. Now, facet 3 is about understanding the recurring storyline. So we've looked at the recurring symbols that we see time and time again. What about storylines? Well, one that we just touched on is death and rebirth. All right, that's part of life. The journey underground, or the journey to somewhere that is dangerous for our hero. The opposite, being able to reach the reward, the heavenly ascent. Search for their father. Sometimes quite literally, we have to find the father that got attacked or lost or something like that, or sometimes just spiritually, like an adopted child who tries to figure out who they are. The opposite is the false father. So someone in the hero's life that we thought was good and then ends up betraying them. So many stories hinge on that. And it's this big reveal that helps the character really learn how to judge people. There's a duality between heaven and hell. Sometimes there's rebel heroes. They didn't want to be the hero and they're kind of the bad guy or the bad boy, and then they transform. The scapegoat, the one that gets blamed for things. Earthly female character that helps. And the opposite, the femme fatale, the siren, who tries to lure the hero away. And Joseph Campbell, who we started off with A Hero with a Thousand Faces, came out with this hero cycle that you should have studied when you studied the Odyssey, because that was one of the first epics to really follow it. And so many stories follow this, and so many modern fantasy stories follow this. If you think of Star Wars, if you think of The Matrix, if you think of Harry Potter, they have a lot of this, where it starts with the character being unknown of their origin, like Harry Potter not knowing he descends from wizards and witches, for example, getting called to an adventure where they meet a mentor. Think of a Gandalf, think of a Dumbledore, right? Usually an older character that takes them over to a world they didn't even know existed or is far beyond their own world. And they have a lot of challenges along the way, and a moment of doubt in the innermost cave where they almost give up, or sometimes they die, sometimes literally die and come back to life, or spiritually. And then at the end, there's a final showdown, usually with the main villain. And at the end, they do get what they were seeking all along, and they return home totally changed. So a lot of stories follow these patterns, and when we look at text, we want to make connections. And something like Small Island doesn't necessarily follow this, but it is about a journey. All of the characters journey away from their comfort zones. Hortense and Gilbert journey away from Jamaica to an England that is harsh, inhospitable, and unwelcoming. Bernard journeys to India, and it forever hardens him and makes him more racist. Queenie journeys away from her small rural town and becomes better because of it.